I am doing great today, Lucas. How about you?
Yeah, I'm doing really good, man, and it is great to be on the show with you today because there is just so much cannabis news going on, and I don't know if you've noticed, but since that election with all those states that became legal, cannabis news is just blowing up everywhere. It's just story after story.
Oh, yeah. Even if you, it seems like every time I open up my news browser, I see a different story on cannabis, whether it's investing or legislation moving through one of the state legislatures or political faux pas people have made with cannabis, a new celebrity brand. We're hearing a lot about these silly celebrity brands. Some of them a little cooler sounding than others. I'm gonna admit, some of the stuff that Seth Rogen's releasing kind of looks really kind of neat, but it's all very couture and very expensive.
Yeah, and it's real interesting on that note because a celebrity can just kind of walk right into the cannabis industry and almost guarantee success, pretty much. I mean, Grateful Dead came out with a line of cannabis, Jay-Z, a whole bunch of different other people. There's a lot of athletes, which is kind of common sense because they use it probably for medicine. But people like you and me, we had to get in the cannabis industry, or other people, it's a lot more effort. So it's real interesting how this kind of is unfolding with celebrities, and is this helping social equity? Is this making the cannabis industry better or worse? So it's kind of an open-ended question still.
I think, honestly, as far as social equity, the celebrity endorsement of cannabis is kind of irrelevant because I don't think basically they're just continuing the trend in the industry to go where the money is. I don't think that speaks ill or good for any social equity concerns. I just think that that's how we are in a very hyper capitalistic, very speculative cannabis market, because I think that you're overstating the chances of success for a lot of these brands. I think that you'll find in the next 5 years that a lot of these brands that you're talking about, the investors, i.e. the celebrities that are investing in these brands, will give them up because they will find that they are losing money. The only celebrity I see who's really seems to be making money in the cannabis game currently is Burner.
Who's that?
Oh, he's a San Francisco Bay Area rapper. He seems to actually make a lot of money opening these cookie stores across the country and stuff.
Yeah, and that's and maybe we should do a top 10 celebrity brand one day and kind of look at that, and maybe we could even get some celebrities on to talk about their cannabis brands if there's something that we might want to think about. And but we're going to stick a little closer to home to get us started today. And I just want to update the audience real quick on cannabis bills going on in Washington State here. We've talked about home grows before, and sorry to say, Uncle Dig, the home grow bill did fail this year. It got just as far as it did last year, and we haven't had a debrief to figure out why it failed. But we're still stuck with no home grows here in Washington.
Well, I think it's time y'all storm the Capitol then.
Well, they tried that and they put up fences, so we'll skip that for now. Yeah, I think we'll avoid that for now. But then another one that is kind of interesting that is passing is HB 1105, and this is a bill that will protect medical cannabis patients from arrest. And we've talked about this before. There's two types of medical cannabis patients in Washington State. One is you just go get the paper, and then you just stick with that sheet of paper. You're what's called a qualifying patient, and then the other is a registered patient. Well, right now, qualified patients don't have protection from arrest, strangely enough. Even if your paper says you can grow 4 plants, and this is happening, Dig. We've got reported incidents happening in Washington. Matter of fact, I'm going to actually try to get some of these folks on the show to tell us their experience. But police are showing up and interacting with patients. They see the sheet of paper says they can grow 4 plants, but the cop's looking at it going, oh, I'm not so sure about this. They take all their cannabis, they take all their lights and everything, and then they make them prove their innocence in court.
So it can protect you from prosecution, not harassment and kidnapping from the police.
Right. You're not protected from arrest, but 1105 seeks to change that. So that one is already pretty much sailing through the legislature. There's another one, I don't know the number, that's going to change the word marijuana to cannabis throughout the RCW code. Dig. That bill is 300 pages. They got marijuana in the RCWs, the revised Code of Washington so much that if you change that word to cannabis, the law to do that is 300 pages long.
Good, do it.
Unbelievable. So they're going to change that. But there's one more bill I want to talk about, SB 5004, and that's a tax break for medical cannabis patients. The last I checked, that we're pretty sure that's going to pass, but right now it's just still sitting there. They're probably still negotiating on that. So we hope that passes, a tax break from this 37% excise tax. So we hope that passes. I don't know. I kind of give it a 50-50 chance of passing. We'll see.
So forgive me, is Washington's a session state, right? Like your legislator meets for a defined number of days and then breaks for the year, right?
Yeah, and they can keep the session going but each, like, there's deadlines, so each goes on like
that's
a month.
why it's important that we keep pressuring them now and not waiting, because it's not a continuous process. If they're not forced to pay attention to this bill, then they can ignore it and not do anything this year. But if their constituents pressure them because it's time sensitive, maybe we can get it passed this year. But if it doesn't make it past a certain point, then we have to wait until the next session, kind of like Texas.
Yeah, well, Washington's kind of interesting because they actually allow a 2 years. So you introduce a bill and it's active 2 years. Now, if it don't make it 2 years, you got to start over. But it's kind of interesting like that. It's just some rule that, it's just like a lot of our rules. It's just made up. They're like, oh, we're going to do a 2-year limit on that. You don't have to do that. They could just keep it going.
Yeah, but that does create some artificial pressure, and it can create a need for, grassroots movements to maybe pressure these politicians during certain arbitrarily created but still manifesting real world consequences. It's important to strategically lobby your Congress people, especially in the state legislatures, in the appropriate time. So would you say it's time for people to bug their local representatives about this?
Definitely. If you're in contact with your House representatives, this would be a great time. And it's specifically the Finance Committee is where it's sitting right now. The fiscal note on this thing is like the state is only going to lose $7,000 on this thing, but they're still concerned about the state losing money. Maybe we'll do a segment next week, exactly pinpoint in on this bill a little more, because it's it has a really rich story behind it, and what's going to happen with it is going to be good if it actually passes. So we'll set aside some time on that. SB 5004. Contact your legislature if you get a chance. Yeah, so we're going to jump into our news real quick, and this is about the Joe Biden White House kind of stepped into the cannabis arena, and is not getting off to necessarily a good start. And how this whole thing got started is Joe Biden first, it came out in the news that they had fired 5 people in the White House for cannabis use. And he was advised apparently by the security agencies, told him that this was not a good idea to have these people in the White House for past cannabis use. I'm guessing they drug tested everybody, but I'm sure they're checking people's Facebook and talking to people too. So they do a whole big interview process on all these people. So it's just not a very good way to get started, Dick, in your White House.
Well, and there's 2 ways of looking at this. And one way is the federal government's not a cannabis-friendly workplace. And at the highest levels of power and trust in the government, where they give you these high security clearances, cannabis use is viewed as a moral weakness, which is laughable, since some of these guys live in the bottom of whiskey bottles. But it's a security clearance thing, I'm sure. But what it does show is how hypocritical the Biden presidency is already being about this. His vice president, Kamala Harris, has bragged about smoking weed. Look, if the Democrats lose the initiative on legal weed, they might as well hand 2022 and 2024 over to the Republicans. The Republican voter base only votes for their pocketbooks. They would vote for Nathan Bedford Forrest if he gave him a tax break. And need I remind you that 1,800 is greater than 1,400s. The Democrats are not doing a good job out of the gate with this politics stuff, are they, Lucas?
No, and it's not very good optics, because what they're doing too at the same time, and there's a good article on this over at the site I write for, Ganjapreneurs, on this, and and it's written by the head of the Last Prisoner Project. It's not a good thing when you have them introducing the Safe Banking Act, and I just wrote an article on this today. They're also introducing an insurance act to help the cannabis industry. So that's hoping all the big capitalists, hoping all the big banksters and everything. But there's a man down in Dallas, a guy with the last name Scott. Sorry, I'm not gotten his first name right now, who was arrested for a joint and then killed in police custody. So you kind of have these two things going on at one time, where they're opening up the cannabis industry for the highest players among us, and at the same time, down at the bottom, the police are still harassing people, like you said, kidnapping people out of their house just for a plant. So it's this, and Joe Biden and them are saying they want to end systemic racism, but they continue the cannabis war. I think.
Listen. We all know that cannabis possession laws are a tool of racist police officers to discriminate. We know the differences in arrests versus the lack of difference in use rates among white and black people. The elephant has long ago stepped into the room and taken a shit on the carpet, and we're still continuing this charade, and it's not good. We need to legalize cannabis to give regressive police forces one less reason to interfere with a citizen's day.
And yeah, because the Democratic Party, and full disclosure, I'm a member and active in the Democratic Party here in Pierce County, they are just not drawing, and we are educating constantly, but the main leaders in this party are still not drawing the line between cannabis legalization and black men getting killed by police. They still haven't connected those two things, and we got to keep working hard, but it seems to me sometimes they just don't want to hear it, because we talk about later in another article, there's a big stereotype around cannabis, so a lot of politicians don't even want to touch it. It's going to take years of very, very hard work to reform police departments in this country and reform our drug laws, and our modern day politicians are not in the business of doing really, really hard work. So we really hope that the Biden administration, maybe there's been a bit of backlash on this, but I agree. If they don't turn this around, they're going to start having problems with the election, because people want cannabis legalization. It's very high in the polls everywhere we go. We'll talk about this here in a minute on the THC caps, but we have to kind of turn this around. So here's another thing. If you're active with your politicians, especially your Democratic politicians, please start talking to them about cannabis. This is not just for Grateful Dead listeners hanging out in their basement, as Wall Street thinks, smoking weed, doing nothing. This cannabis issue is a very serious issue, and that's one thing we try to get across on this show, Dig, is how serious this issue actually is. And I really appreciate it. I just want to thank you again for being on the show with me to help take this message forward.
Well, it's important because there's a lot of vulnerable groups in this country that are taken advantage of because of our drug laws and because of the way our medicine system works. And it's unconscionable, but I think the problem is pervasive enough, and the cronyism and corruption is blatant enough that we are at the real headwind of some real institutional change. But it's got to start from people engaging with those institutions. It doesn't just sitting at home and not doing anything about it doesn't help. You got to get out. You got to let your voice be heard. So get vaccinated and get out there.
Absolutely right. So now we're going to move overseas and a little bit, kind of on the same note a little bit, but still in the politic arena in cannabis. But this is in France. And this is in a town called Reims. I believe I'm pronouncing it right. I'm probably not saying it in the proper French way, I'm sure.
Yeah, I have trouble with it too. It's spelled Reims. It's one of the larger cities in the area that's known for champagne production. It's the champagne capital.
Yes, and their mayor, who is a self-admitted, quote, right-winger, he is actually saying that area should open up and start legalizing cannabis, but with a little bit of a stipulation that it's not for tourism. I think they're learning from places like Amsterdam and other places that are trying to get the tourists out of there, that they don't want tourists coming for this. But I believe there's probably still come just to check it out.
Yeah, the mayor. Well, the mayor, his name's Arnaud Robinette. I'm sorry if my pronunciation's not right on that. That's how I read it in English. He's the mayor. He's been the mayor since 2014, and he's bringing up some really excellent points. At least in this article I got off RFI. I think it's a English translation of a French website. It's he brings some harm reduction things with adolescents using it early and using a possibly adulterated product or spice instead of the real thing. So he brings up some safety issues. He also thinks that if it was a regulated market, adolescent access would be lessened. And I know that you and I can back that up as we've seen cannabis become legal in Washington and Oregon and California. We've noticed that it's no longer the cool forbidden fruit among the teenagers that it once was.
Right. Yep.
So I would like, and it's interesting. And I don't know I know in England, conservative and liberal can mean different things, but versus the United States. And I know this guy is considered a right winger. I don't know if maybe the right wing in France is still like liberty focused, like our right wing here pays lip service to. If they are making liberty arguments, I would say that libertarians and conservative small government types should be pro-cannabis because it doesn't do the damage that even alcohol does, and it provides more jobs than alcohol ever will. And they're green jobs. They're good, environmentally friendly jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And so hope they get that done in France, and we'll keep an eye on that. Next, we're going to bring it back over here to the United States, and we're going to talk about Florida, but this is actually happening in Washington State, and I also know this is happening in Colorado. And this is another sort of hot button issue for Dig and I, and this is these THC caps. And what this is if you're familiar with alcohol, you know, alcohol is what's called proofed. And so you can't have it above a certain amount legally. Now, I don't know those exact numbers, but they're wanting to do the same thing with the concentrates in cannabis and even THC, even flower, Dig, which is shocking how they would think they're going to keep a flower with the same THC all the time. But they're wanting to cap these things like a dab or a concentrate pen at like 60%. I even saw one person in Colorado was wanting to cap it like 17% or something. So these bills are going all over the country, and they're wanting to cap THC in certain cannabis products, and it's just really bad policy.
It's bad policy for, I think, a couple of primary reasons. One is that if you make the concentrates limits that low, you're going to have to adulterate the concentrates. Mm-hmm. And I worry that adding filler product to a concentrate product is going to be listen, there is very little safe ways to bring a cannabis concentrate that's naturally higher than the rates they're showing in this article. Right. The article's off of WFSU.org. It's not safe if you're going to take a THC concentrate that's at something at 70% and then you're going to cut it down to 60 or 55% to meet some state regulation. We've seen what happens when we use adulterants in our cannabis. Remember what happened with vitamin E acetates and all the outlaw vapes making everybody sick? Florida is setting people up for hazards when they're acting like they're protecting people. Listen, the other big issue is that this weakens people's medicine. And there's a danger to that. You're making people who would normally only have to buy so much buy more to get the same effect. So this may seem like they're trying to limit the THC consumption by consumers. All this is going to mean that people have to consume more flower to achieve the same effect. It's bad policy.
It is, and you have to wonder, like you said, what they're going to cut it down with. And, you know, I know somebody who's a medical patient. I mean, that's all they use is the high concentrate, and it actually helps them out a lot. So if you start cutting that down, they'll have to buy more. And if you're cutting it down with some kind of weird product, they'll have to consume more of that. So that adds to health issues. Another concern I have is it will just send the cannabis back down onto the underground market, which is not always safe there either because of pesticides. And then you got the butane hash oil labs and all this stuff. People blowing themselves up and all these things. So there's just a whole bunch of concerns about this. But you know what bothers me the most about this, Dig? It is absolutely, positively bad science, because what they're basing this on is the fact that they have all these bunk studies. And I'm going to say that right now. I have an education, I have a master's degree, I'm trained to read research, I know how to read research, I've paid attention to all this stuff. It's not good science. And all this science, some of it says that high THC cannabis causes psychosis. And this is arguments that go all the way back to the early 1900s.
It's a misrepresentation of the results they got in the research. What can be said is that using cannabis, specifically high THC cannabis, not CBD dominant cannabis, for people who are vulnerable to certain kinds of psychiatric disorders, who may manifest them, may not. If they're vulnerable to that, like schizophrenia may be one. We still don't have definitive research on this. It can cause problems with those disorders, but it's a negligible percentage of people who this is affected by. And if we had better mental health access in this country, we would have already identified those people and be able to help them through that. Because a lot of times, if it's not cannabis that's going to set it off, it's going to be something else.
Right. And a lot of the science points to, well, a lot of problems with the science too is all done during prohibition times. So most of these articles and research that I'm seeing are actually just going back looking at old science done, or lit reviews, they're calling them. So they just go back and look at the old literature.
Well, and that's the problem. Some of the old literature was based on police reports, which is
right.
They're not reliable.
Yep, and the bias in the universities, bias everywhere when it comes to cannabis. They were looking for it to be bad. They were wanting to prove that it was bad because of the drug war and all that. So it's all based, this idea that cannabis is causing psychosis, the idea that more youth are using it, the idea that it's causing more problems with our youth. These are all things that have not been actually proven in double-blind, real scientific studies. And I say, let's not make public policy, and let's not give in to people who are using bad science too. That's something I believe in. We don't want to give in to bad science and make public policy based on things that aren't correct.
No, I think that if you're in Florida, if this is defeated soundly, then they may try it a couple more times. If it's defeated every time, they'll give up. Eventually, they'll stop wanting to spend money on stuff that keeps losing. Let's make treating cannabis like a dangerous substance like alcohol. Let's not make that the norm. Let's say no, and let's tell this guy to kick rocks.
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to do out there. And I think it is working, because I did an article. There's an article and some research out there with a poll that says most Floridians don't support the THC caps. And a lot of Floridians are for legal cannabis, and a very high majority of Floridians are for medical cannabis access. So I think it was only 17% of Floridians, and this poll skewed conservative that I'm referring to, 17% of them, they believe that there should be THC caps. So that is a good sign. But like I said, there's a bill like that in Washington, and then there's a bill like that in Colorado too. Both this is sponsored by Democrats. But now we're going to get on to another article. This one, I'm just going to talk for a second on this, but this is about, they're starting to notice, believe it or not, that stoners, quote, are an actual market to advertise to. And one of the things is like a no-brainer in the article I thought was hilarious. They said 58% of people like to smoke weed and listen to music. 46%, Dig, like to smoke weed and eat snacks. So Wall Street, beware, folks. They're coming for you.
I love the kind of statistics that they like to quote in these advertising articles. Advertising is, of course, a pseudoscience, obviously, because even if you don't smoke weed in America, you're probably still going to eat snacks. So, whatever.
Yep. And you might watch TV. And you might listen to music in the afternoon.
I think that this Bloomberg article that we're reading points out to something in the culture that's happening right now, is that a lot of mainstream people that are in no way countercultural or far left or far right or revolutionary or fans of extreme music or extreme behavior, real quote unquote squares, they're coming around and they're getting involved in the cannabis culture. And they're both changing it, and they're also noticing it, some of them for the first time. I read an article recently, like last month, where someone was like describing dabs in these breathless tones, like, oh my God, and they do this. And I'm like, people have been dabbing for like a while. Where have you been? You know what I mean? So people who normally don't take notice are noticing, and that's going to have profound effects on the culture moving forward.
Yeah, and that was actually the original way Herodotus noticed that people were using cannabis, was a very primitive way of dabbing, which would be to heat up some stones, throw a bunch of flour on it, and get in a tent with it. Some speculate that might have been Moses' burning bush. And also when they had the tent, we were talking about this the other day on Facebook, some people like what was in the Holy of Holies and all this stuff. So this dabbing and cannabis oil has always been around. It's just fascinating to see that Wall Street is starting to take notice. But my thing is, personally, I never want any of their junk anyway. So I'm just gonna find it amusing when I start seeing the stoner ads come out on TV.
I'm already like kind of a big fan of buying stoner knickknacks. I have more bongs than I need. I have more pipes than I'll ever need. I think that once more people realize that certain people will collect glass and stuff, I think that we've already seen that in the glass market. Mm-hmm. There's much more selection of like different types of smoking devices than there were even, I think, 5 years ago, in my opinion. And I think that's a symptom of people noticing that of a whole manufacturing, modality being moved towards cannabis consumers. And I think that's interesting to see what other industries besides the glass industry take notice of us and start trying to cater to us.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting going forward. And so now we are going to get into our first dig update of the spring growing season. And so looking forward to that. Let's listen to Dig's garden update real quick.
Uncle Dig's garden update. Hey guys, welcome back to a shorter episode of Bagseed Chronicles, where we're going to talk a little bit about the garden. We are in Zone 8B, and it is March 28th, 2021. My indoor garden finished up because my black domina, just before the last week of flowers started, decided to have a mite infestation, which was unfortunate, but we were able to harvest her and cut off all the mites. They hadn't made it to the inside colas yet, so I think that stuff's still going to smoke just fine. It might not be ideal, but it's going to be weed in the jar, which is always appreciated. In my veg tent, I have the DLD, which is that strain that I keep at my house that I like to play with. And the neighbor, the friend of mine who I was going to give this DLD seedling to, had a grow setup issue, i.e. her grow setup. I got up and it walked away. So I have some more time with this plant. So what I did is I took my first clone. I'm so excited to try this. So it is at day 5. It doesn't have roots yet, but I am hopeful. The cut doesn't look that rough, so I think it's going to work out fine. Anyway, that's it for me. Guys, have a great and wonderful spring, and let's overgrow the world.
All right, great garden update there, Dig, and really great that you mentioned your podcast there, the Backseat Chronicles. We'll talk about that towards the end of the show. But let's talk about your garden update real quick. Some interesting stuff in there. And one thing I found interesting is you got some bugs. And this is something that a caretaker of mine suffers a lot from because he kind of lives out into the woods a little more than I do. So he has a little problems with bugs. And so you had a problem with mites, right?
Yeah. So this is the first time I've ever had mites. A little background. I usually do a lot of just constant integrated. We call it integrated pest management. That's what I call it, where you don't just spray things. You also might release beneficials and stuff like that. Well, when I went indoors this winter, I thought, well, let me see how long I can push it before I have a problem. And it turns out that I had a problem in week 7.5 of flower on my 8 to 9 week strains. That was unfortunate, but it was lucky I caught it. The mites are really hard to see, and I already had a little bit of webbing on one of my fan leaves, and I didn't know what it was. I kind of got closer. I had to scope it to see what it was, and I could barely see the mites. And so I thought, well, I can't treat the plant late in flower. Even stuff that's gentle is going to affect the plant basically past halfway through flower, past about week 4. You really don't want to spray anything on them. So I thought, well, it's a little early, but I do see like 1 or 2 amber trichomes. I'm just going to pull it. And so I pulled it. I trimmed the plant a little bit closer than I normally would to kind of get all the mites, as many of the mites off as I could. And I just trimmed some of the skinniest branches yesterday, and I took a little bit to try some of the trim, and it's fine. It turned out fine. So the mites didn't ruin my harvest because I caught them. So you got to you see a lot of growers that seem to just be staring at their plant all dreamy eyed, and you're like, what is he looking at? Like, boring. You're looking for things that are hard to see that might indicate pests or nutrient deficiencies. If you catch them early enough, sometimes they can be as not a big of a deal. It was an early harvest, which is better than an on-time harvest that's plumb full of mites.
Yeah, because those things can get up into the flower nooks and crannies there, and they'll make their little webs in there, and that's how you know you have a really bad infestation. And once they get into that flower and make those webs in the flower, yeah, you can't smoke it. So it's really good you caught it. And I'm glad you mentioned beneficial insects. And if the audience wants to go over to Radio Tacoma and check out our CannaCon documentary that we did, they have a part in there about a guy talking about they have companies that sell beneficial insects just to the cannabis industry, and they have wasps that will come and eat those mites and ladybugs and all kinds of things. But I found a really interesting person that I saw on Facebook. His name is Shangro Los. He's sort of a cannabis activist and a nationwide cannabis figure, I guess you'd call him. And he is starting a cannabis garden indoors around here. And he was saying that he started having pill bugs, commonly referred to where I'm from as roly-polies, in his garden, and they were chewing on the plants. I've never heard of those as beneficial insects, but he was kind of saying that they were beneficial insects. Now, I can see them maybe eating the humus down on the floor of your garden or in your pots or everything, but if they're eating on the plant, I don't necessarily know how beneficial they are, because I think those pill bugs are, I don't think they're predatory insects, but they may be. But it's fascinating how you can make your own little ecosystem how you want to, if you choose to.
Yeah, I mean, and you can do unorthodox things like that. I would say that it's my understanding that pill bugs, even more so than other things, are primarily focused on eating like detritus, like stuff that's breaking down.
Yeah. So
it would kind of cause me concern if I had a living cannabis plant that the pill bug appeared to be consuming. Mm-hmm. Anything that is consuming part of your plant is probably not a beneficial.
Yeah, it could get a little risky, and it could get out of hand too. Because aphids chew on your plant too, and you definitely don't want those. So I'll keep an eye on and see what he says. And
I'm interested to see what happens with that.
Yeah, I was kind of shocked that I saw that, because I never really thought about roly-polies as beneficial insects too, as far as like on a plant goes, but we used to just find them in the dirt and play with them. So
now I have read that some of the bigger roly-polies are predatory insects, the faster ones.
Okay.
So the little ones that we saw down south, the little black ones that look like little armadillos with no armadillo head or tail.
Yeah.
Roll up into a tight ball when you pick them up, and you could roll them around in your hand, right?
Yep.
Those eat rotted, rotten wood, dead stuff, detritus, broken down humus in the soil, like you said. But I know that there are some larger species that are really fast moving that actually seem to be hunters. So I think that might be location dependent. So that's why I'd say it'd be interesting to see how that turns out for him, because if he's got another infestation that they're living off of, I'd be interested to see how those are beneficial.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to mention, if you ever get spider mites again, something that somebody I know has tried is you take your plant. It's a little labor intensive, but you can spray it down with like a water hose or either in your shower. And supposedly those mites are hydrophobic. So they were saying if you spray the mites real good, the mites will pop. They actually don't like that water. So if you really had a plant that was really close to finishing and you were really concerned, you could take that thing and wash it down. It would help, but then you got to dry it out. That might lead to mold. So even those kind of things are kind of risky. But let's talk about your clones for a second. So you started cloning, and
I tried my first clone.
Yeah. You've been saying you were going to do that, and I'm really glad you tried it, because cloning is one of those things where it's kind of difficult to get consistent. And so just a quick review for anybody listening that's heard us talk about this before. So a clone is just you're taking a cannabis plant and you're taking a clipping from it, and then you put it into some material, and then it grows roots, and then you have the exact same cannabis plant again. And you can keep that thing going for generation after generation. They have cannabis cultivars that are some in the stores that go back 20, 30, 40 years. So like the Blue Dream, if you're finding that in the store, supposedly that is a clone-only plant. And so somebody's been keeping that thing going for 20-something years, Dig.
Yeah, and some plants are more open to that than others. And the reason I'm cloning this plant isn't to keep this plant going. It's because I want to grow this particular seedling outdoors, and I want to establish a clone so I can flower the clone instead of the seedling to see what sex the plant is.
Yeah, that's a common technique. So if you're breeding and you don't know what sex the plant is, then you can take some clippings and then put it into flower, which that's that 12 on, 12 off light cycle. And it will trick the plant, and it will flower, and that way you can tell if it's a male or female. And then you don't waste 9 months watering that.
Yeah, then you just throw out the clone, and then you've still got the seedling. You've still got the same individual plant, and then you can take. Also, what you can do is if you like, I like tap roots outside, especially in the hot Oregon. Tap roots seem to help the plants grow just a little bit bigger stalks. So when I like a seedling outside, but I'm trying to learn how to clone so that I can sex my seedlings in advance, so I don't have to pull anything and waste any soil or medium outdoors in my big pots when I'm pulling like 2-3 foot tall males.
And so if you want to clone at home, if you're growing a cannabis plant, and you can do this with any plant, matter of fact, it works good with lavender too. What you want to do is you need a couple different things. You need some root gel that will help get the roots going a little faster. You can buy that. There's lots of brands online. You're going to need some kind of medium to stick the cutting into. Now, if you really want to, that can be dirt, or you can buy rock wool cubes. You're going to need some water, and you're going to need a container to put this in. So what you do is on a cannabis plant is you want to take your pretty healthy leaf, not up at the top, but a healthy limb. You want to count down 4 nodes, and a node is where the leaf hits the main stalk. So count down 4. And then you want to go down to the 5th node and cut right above that. Never cut right below the node, because that's going to have problems growing roots. You take that, put the gel on it, stick it in your medium, put that in the container with the water. You let that sit for about 2 weeks. Some might take 3 weeks, and then it will clone. You can see the roots start growing out. Then you take that, put it in your soil. Boom, you got a new cannabis plant. And all these cultivars you're buying in the stores, that's how they keep them going. They'll clone these things for generations after generations. All right, so now we're going to move on to our final segment of the show, and that is our It's a Bust segment. And this story comes to us again out of my home state of Alabama, and it is about two men that are about to be released from prison. One is 71, I believe the other one is 66. They both were sentenced to life in prison on a 3 strikes you're out sort of law called the Alabama Habitual Offender Law. One was for trafficking cannabis. The other man was for trafficking cocaine. And they are about to be released in Jefferson County, which is in Birmingham, probably the biggest city there in Alabama. But it's just so interesting to find that the judge is actually throwing out their sentences and going to release them.
And, it's good that this judge is deciding to do this. It's good that they're overturning these guys' parole-free convictions. I mean, these are guys that were convicted of nonviolent crimes, and they were serving life without parole. If you don't see that as state violence, I don't know what to tell you. However, you're seeing individuals within the system take a look at the newest social science, paying attention to what we're learning about drugs and about the people who use drugs and about how the police interact with the people that use drugs. And certain individuals like judges can have an outsized influence on the system if they make the right decision. So I think it's important that we examine other people that we can influence besides politicians. Judges are a good example of people that you can write letters to. And in some states, judges are elected leaders. So if you don't like a judge who keeps locking up people for petty cannabis offenses, vote for someone else.
Yeah, and another tool that's long been used in the cannabis activism world is jury nullification. So that's out there too. But you were right, and I think this is actually a really big deal, maybe a little bigger than we think it is, that a judge would overturn this, because I'd say even a year ago this wouldn't have happened. It's because of states like South Dakota that are legalizing. It's because of states. I mean, Alabama is really close to passing a medical cannabis bill. They almost have it done. I'm not sure what it's going to look like. But Florida has medical cannabis. For goodness sakes, Mississippi has medical cannabis. And we'll talk about this. It is a absolute mess what they got going on over there. But nevertheless, 70% of people in Mississippi said they wanted medical cannabis. That's amazing. And so I think these judges are seeing that, saying, well, we got to do something a little different here. It's great to see.
Hey, and I know you mentioned jury nullification, and some of our listeners may not be aware of what that is. Could you maybe say a little bit about that?
Basically, the only thing I really know about it is if you were a juror on a cannabis case, or just any case necessarily, you could decide at the beginning, if it was for cannabis, jurors do this, that they weren't going to convict. And if it's not a 12 person, if you can't get 12 people, then the person's not convicted. So
correct. Yeah. And there are a few states that can still convict with what's called a hung jury. Oregon is one of them. That's another reason why we need to lobby our legislators to close these loopholes for law enforcement to continue to lock away people, even if it's against the people's wishes.
Yeah, and that's an individual's choice when they're on the jury. And for someone like you or I was just selected to be on the jury. I didn't go because I'm not comfortable being blind, being around people during a pandemic. So I said, well, I'm not going to be able to do this right now. But if I was to go, they would have weeded me out of a cannabis trial. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
So most of the time, people like you or I or other cannabis activists won't actually make it into a cannabis or drug-related trial. But some have, and it is a thing I've heard about jury nullification.
I've always wanted to be on a jury, but I never get picked.
But
get him out of here. What does he mean he doesn't believe the police have the power to detain people for their safety? Who is this guy?
Right. And it was my first time going, and I wanted to go, but I just was like, well, I can't do it because I can't do the whole social distance thing. I can't. People can walk right up on me and I can't see it or back away or things like that. So I just didn't feel safe. I told them after the pandemic, but this is my first time, so maybe 20 years they'll call me again.
Yeah.
But we are about to get out of here, and I want to thank Dig for being on the show with me today. And if you want to contact us, send over an email to info@Radio Tacoma and make the subject line Cannabis Corner, and they will get it over to us. But Dig, you have some big news. You started a podcast on cannabis, and tell us your Instagram and how people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, I have a podcast. It's called Bagseed Chronicles. You can find it on any of your podcasting apps. If it's not on the app, email me at uncledig4@gmail.com, and I'll try to get on that app as well. And you can follow me along on my gardening adventures and bong rip adventures at Uncle Dig on Instagram.
This is Cannabis Corner, hosted by Lucas Barfield. If you would like to get in contact with your host, he is on Twitter at MJIsMedicine. Your musical selection is The Happy Monster by Chubby Jackson and his orchestra, recorded on 78 in 1947. You can find this music and much more at the Great 78 Project, an archive of historical music recordings at great78.archive.org. You are listening to 101.9 KTAH, Radio Tacoma.